Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've kind of wanted to cover for a while, and that is utilizing underutilized cards. So there's a lot of Digimon in the Digimon card game that really haven't seen much play, if any at all, and I feel like that's a little bit of a shame, but that's just the nature on how card games go, where some cards just excel just because of their high levels of usability, and other cards just kind of fall to the wayside because they might not be doing much, or it might require a little bit too much of an investment in order to make the card worthwhile. But whatever the reason may be, there's still just a ton of Digimon that don't see a whole lot of play, and as such, they can be a little bit hard to build with and around just because we don't have a whole lot of data to go off of. So usually what I mean by data is that we could take an example of how Japan has applied or utilized the card and put it into perspective on how we want to play and utilize the card. So that way we have some sort of base or foundation so we could further understand on how to utilize the card effectively. But sometimes that's not always the case, and we don't always have data for that. But there's still a trick to figuring out how we could best apply the card based on two big factors. So one of the big factors is reading into the card, and the other factor is reading past the card. So what I mean by reading into the card is basically just reading the card at face value. Just what is the card doing as a whole, alone, without any support or anything. And then reading past the card is basically exactly as it sounds, where we are looking past what the card is initially doing to look at his support and all of his tools and look at the intention behind how the card or the Digimon wants to be played. So in this example, I'm going to be using Bancho Leomon. So Bancho Leomon has seen a total of 0 top results in Japan and is basically a card that no one really is thought to be playing around with just because there are more efficient and powerful tools that Green could be playing around with. So that kind of just leaves Bancho Leomon in a really bad spot, and as such, he has literally seen almost 0 play. But I have a personal bias towards Bancho Leomon. He is one of my favorite Digimon, so I was challenging myself to figure out how I could best utilize Bancho Leomon. So first, I had to understand what Bancho Leomon is currently doing. So Bancho Leomon is a green level 6. Stats are literally nothing too special to write home about, but he does have a really interesting on-delete ability where we get to suspend up to 2 of the opponent's Digimon. So his on-delete ability usually in my head means that I want to be aggressive with him because it is an on-delete on a level 6, and most of the time you don't want to actively try to delete your own level 6 unless you're trying to aggress into the opponent's security. So Bancho Leomon's on-delete ability just innately wants me to think that this is an aggressive card, but what the on-delete ability is actually doing definitely seems to be telling a different story. So the ability to suspend up to 2 of the opponent's Digimon is really, really powerful, but if I do that during my turn and I'm losing my level 6 to get this ability off, then I need to have something else on the field to complement him with, or I just say this is not an aggressive ability, I don't want this to trigger during my turn, I want this to trigger on the opponent's turn. So those are kind of like the leading factors on how we look at the card at base value and figure out what we want to be doing with him. So this is the part where now that we have a base understanding of what Bancho Leomon is doing, the best way to understand the card is to look at the bigger picture and see his evolution line on how the evolution line wants to be utilizing him. So if we start off with Leomon, Leomon has a when digivolving ability of suspending one of the opponent's Digimon with 3000 DP down. So this really doesn't seem like it's doing a whole lot, but what this card is basically telling me to do is it is telling me that it wants a Digimon to be suspended. So why do I want the Digimon to be suspended? It's for Grap Leomon. So Grap Leomon has this when attacking ability of gaining 1 memory. So what the evolution line is telling me to do is to use Leomon to rest something down, to then digivolve into Grap Leomon, to delete it to gain 1 memory, and then I digivolve with Grap Leomon suspended into Bancho Leomon, so that way he's going into the opponent's turn suspended, where if they deal with the card then they're going to have to suffer his on-delete ability, or if they leave him be, then I could utilize him to be a little bit aggressive with, to attack into the opponent's security, because now I could figure out the best way to utilize his on-delete ability. So that's kind of like a base example of what I mean by reading past the card, is figuring out what the evolution line wants to be doing to best support the card that we want to be utilizing. And then, like I said earlier, this applies to literally almost any Digimon in the game, so that way you could at least try to figure out the best way to utilize some underutilized Digimon. But I'll be going over how to build a deck using Bancho Leomon as the example of the underutilized card that I want to figure out how to best play. So if Bancho Leomon is going to be the star of the show, then he's already going to be automatically included in the deck. I'll just put him at base 4 of, but that might change all depending on the other types of cards that we're running. So with Bancho Leomon's ability, we know that we want to be attacking with our level 5s because that's what Leomon is doing. But we might not necessarily want to be utilizing Leomon exactly, just because there might be more efficient cards at being aggressive with our green level 5s. So if I try to search up what the other green level 5s are doing, I could get a better picture of what I want to be looking at and what I want to be utilizing. So we just go green level 5, and then we could see all of the green level 5s that we have access to want to be working with. So if we know that Leomon has this on-attacking of gaining 1 memory, well, he's not exactly the most powerful of level 5s in the game that we have access to. So we might want something a little bit more powerful or a little bit safer to swing with. So we could think about utilizing something like an Orochimon, where we Digivolve up into Orochimon, then Orochimon gives himself piercing, then we utilize that piercing to attack into the opponent's Digimon, and then deal some security damage at the same time. And then after we're done with Orochimon, then we just Digivolve into Bancho Leomon. So that is one possible line of play that we could be thinking about, but we could go even one step further and think, okay, well, if Orochimon dies to the security check, then what is the whole point of attacking with the card? So we could utilize something like Dinobemon to basically accomplish almost the exact same thing, just because he has the piercing ability natively and he has jamming. So we could utilize Dinobemon very aggressively to just swing into the opponent's rested Digimon to delete it and then deal security damage very safely because of the jamming ability. So I think out of all of the other options that we have access to, because we could play something like Jewelbemon just because he has high DP, but again, like if we're really just trying to figure out what is the most aggressive card we could play in our level 5 slot, so that way we could attack as safely as we possibly can for Bancho Leomon, then Dinobemon is looking to be the best fit for that role. So we would probably end up playing Dinobemon. And then on top of that, thinking about how else we wanted to play Bancho Leomon, if the point is to get Bancho Leomon to go into the opponent's turn suspended, then we have some really good ways at doing that with the Digisorption ability. So the Digiabsorption ability, we actually are okay with using it on itself, so that way the Digimon will end up rested, but because it basically evolved for free, that just means we could get up into Bancho Leomon that much more efficiently, and Bancho Leomon is still rested going into the opponent's turn, at least the turn you Digivolve up into him. So I definitely think compared to a lot of the other options that Blossomon is going to be a really good pick. If we really wanted to, we could play something defensive like Cherrymon just to sit on an ultimate that's still relatively decent, or we could try to do something cute with Jagamon, but again, I just feel like for what Bancho Leomon is trying to be doing, that Blossomon is going to be the next best card, because if we wanted to use the card aggressively, we could, or again, we're just mainly trying to use Digisorption on itself to go into a fast Bancho. So now that we know the best level 5s that we have access to and could be utilizing, I mean, we could add in a one of Argamon if we really felt like it, just because he also has the Digisorption ability and a really nice when attacking ability, but let's just exclude him for now, just to see where the rest of the deck is going. So the next thing we should be looking at is what are some of the better support megas to be playing around with Bancho Leomon. So we already know that he's not really good alone, and he definitely needs some support. So what are some of the best cards that we could play with interacting with the opponent's Digimon, especially if they are rested? So if we just search up the green level 6s that we have, then we get to see all of the level 6s that we have access to. So we could play something like Grand Kawagamon, or we could play something like Bancho Stingmon, because they have piercing, and if he gets deleted from a security check, then we could rest the opponent's Digimon down and utilize their abilities that way. But the only problem with these cards is they're not necessarily super great alone, and they themselves need more support. So they're going to be a little bit more cumbersome to run in this style of deck, but we could utilize the fact that they're interacting with rested Digimon to play something like Mega Gargamon, where he at least is going to be getting security attack +1, which is pretty decent, and he could even stun lock another opponent's Digimon down. But we have a better card if the goal is to utilize the stun lock ability and to utilize the fact that they're rested. We could think about utilizing Puppetmon instead. So Puppetmon is a really good card because if Bancho Leomon gets deleted and then 2 of the opponent's Digimon get rested, we feel okay with just hard playing a Puppetmon to just stun lock a 3rd Digimon and their entire field from restanding for the turn. Even though we are going to be giving them lots of memory, that's not necessarily a bad thing, considering if they're unable to utilize that memory, then it's still just in our favor to want to hard play Puppetmon. Plus, Puppetmon has a really nice extra ability of when attacking gaining 1 memory, so that way we could even be efficient with him that way as well. So I definitely think Puppetmon is going to be a really good option to think about running, and in BT04 we even get something like Nidhoggmon, where we could also think about using Nidhoggmon to use his when Digivolving ability of Digiburst 4 to suspend all of the opponent's Digimon that are 5,000 DP or less down. So this way we could utilize Bancho to target their higher stuff, then Digivolve into Nidhogg, and then rest all of their lower stuff, and then anything that's rested on their field gets put to the bottom of the deck, which is just super powerful board wipe removal potential. So I definitely think we want to go more of a way to supplement the fact that he's going to be rested versus just trying to deal some raw damage. But we could also think about utilizing some other cards that are acting very similar to him if we so felt like it, like Rosemon, but Rosemon has her own strengths and weaknesses, and I definitely feel like going with either Puppet and or Nidhogg definitely is more impactful for the deck, just because these are also very good standalone cards in their own right. Next, I would probably look at green level 3s, so that way I could figure out what are the best green levels 3s that I could utilize to then dictate what my level 4s should be, just because usually the low levels is where we're going to be wanting our inheritable effects to be at. So just looking at the green level 3s, we could see that we definitely want some really decent inheritable abilities and some just generically decent abilities. So we could play something like Kokuamon to get an extra security attack off of him. We could play something like Terriermon to prevent them from gaining memory. If we're playing around with Digiburst, Lalamon and Palmon are good, but I'm not entirely sure that this is a Digiburst focused deck, so these are probably not necessarily the answers. We probably would consider wanting to play Tentamon just because of his on-play ability being super nice. So let's just throw in some Tentamons. Don't worry, I'll fix the ratios after. I just want to make sure that I have the pool of cards that I want first before I whittle down into the ratios that I would prefer. So if we're also looking at being really aggressive and we want some of their Digimon to be rested, then Tentamon is looking to be a really good card, so that way we could pick off a lot of their low-level Digimon. So I definitely really like Tentamon because he's also playing around with the fact that we want to suspend the opponent's Digimon down. I don't necessarily think we need something like Wormmon because we want to Digivolve up into our level 5s and we're aggressing with our level 5s. So if we're trying to make our level 5s as aggressive as we can be, we could think about playing with either Palmon or Agumon. So I definitely like both of those options being available to us. And then we always just have our good classic tempo card that we could even be thinking about. So before I start whittling down these, this looks like a pretty good selection of possible level 3s that I could be thinking about. So now I would consider taking a look at the level 4s to see what we want in our level 4 slot. So if we open up our level 4s, usually it would be a good safe bet to just want to include a blocker in the deck. So we probably would want the tempo blocker. Even though we could consider running Woodmon, I just like the tempo efficiency of the new blockers, so I'll just be running that. But again, you could go either way. If you really wanted to, you could even just include both of them and just have just a champion level blocker lineup. I definitely like the fact that we could consider utilizing Kabuterimon's ability, and we could also think about utilizing Stingmon's ability, where Stingmon is gaining us a memory, which is effectively what Leomon was doing, where we're just utilizing his ability to be paired up with Dino B, so that way we get basically a pseudo better Leomon out of it, or we could just increase the DP with Kabuterimon. And then we also have something like Roachmon if we just want raw efficiency, and we also could consider something like Vegemon as well for just raw efficiency also. And then we have the clone of Kabuterimon in the form of Gargamon. So we just have a ton of level 4s that we could be thinking about utilizing. Next, I would definitely start looking at the Tamers just because there's not a whole lot of them, so the choices are going to be limited and a little bit easier to pick from. So realistically, we're just probably going to be looking for a memory fixing Tamer, and that's it. So we don't need to worry about Taiga and Izzy or Yoshino or the other Izzy at all. So we could just ignore those cards entirely, and we're just looking at Mimiya, Davis, and Ken. So Davis is pretty interesting because he allows us to just fish for a lot of our green cards and then add it to our hand. So Davis could be pretty good if we're looking to draw some cards. We could think about utilizing Mimi if we want to turbo out our raising area, or we could utilize Ken because he'll gain us an additional memory for deleting our opponent's Digimon through battle. So I think out of all of the Tamers, I would probably consider going Davis or Mimi before Ken, just because we're not really a piercing deck. Because we could get caught in those situations where we're not really trying to pierce at all, or we don't have Dino B and we can't pierce. So I definitely think these two are the better ones, and I think it just based on the way the deck wants to be played, I think Mimi is just the better of the two Tamers, even though Davis could help with the consistency and open up some blue cards for us. I definitely still think that Mimi is probably better, just because turboing out our raising could be very devastating for the opponent, because it allows us to be even more aggressive with our other cards. And then as far as options go, there's not really a whole lot that I would consider playing. So we could consider playing Flower Cannon just because we still want the ability to rest the opponent's Digimon down, so that way we could attack into it when we need to. I would definitely still play Hidden Potential, even though it got limited to 1. It's still just an absolutely insane card, and now that it's limited to 1, the opponent just basically can never play around it because they don't know when you have it most of the time unless it's checked in your security. We could play around with Terrace Cluster just because it's a really good removal card. Then having Bancho be deleted and then Terra Cluster, whatever the card rested, is still just a pretty powerful combo play. We could consider Needle Spray just because Needle Spray is doing basically the exact same thing as Flower Cannon, or we could think about running Electroshocker just because it is a slightly more efficient version of Terrace Cluster, so we still can interact with the fact that their Digimon is going to be rested and we have a good removal for it. And then lastly, we have our Digitamas, just because our Digitamas are still super important, but like the Tamers, there's just not a whole lot of options that we could choose from. So we could consider utilizing Fremon, but again, I don't think the DP boosting really matters for this style of deck. I think Argamon is definitely really good because he could definitely gain us some memory, because if the idea is to have a banchleomon be suspended and the opponent not to want to attack into banchleomon because of his on-delete ability, then he combos really nicely with Argamon, so that way when he stands during our turn, we gain an extra memory. So I think Argamon is definitely looking to be very, very powerful. And then the only other real good one is going to be either Motimon or Minomon. So these two are just really good at gaining us basically the same level of buff, so I would probably just consider either of them, whichever one you feel like best fit for what you want. So I'm just going to choose Minomon because I just prefer Minomon over Motimon. No offense, Motimon, it's not you, it's me. Oh, and I almost forgot that we even have level 7s that we could even think about utilizing. So we did get some level 7s that basically are supposed to play with banchleomon, because banchleomon is half of Chaosmon. So we have the Chaosmons that we also can think about. So I definitely think this is a really good looking pool of cards that we could start whittling down into a deck, all that's centered around banchleomon, making him work the best that we possibly can. But again, this type of concept could basically work with almost any Digimon you want. You just need to critically think and analyze what is the card doing and how could I best support the card with the cards that we currently have. So that's just the whole core and concept, is just taking a look at what the card is doing and what cards best support him based on what the card is doing. And the easiest way that we could gain any form of information is by looking at his evolution line to help us decide what cards we want to be playing around with to best support him if there's no data for us to go off of, because thankfully Japan does have quite a lot of data that we can look at. So with the deck whittled down, this is kind of the version that I've been settling on. And yes, while this basically is just a Chaosmon Turbo deck, the whole point is to try to utilize banchleomon in a really interesting way. And the fact that we could basically leave banchleomon rested if the opponent attacks into him, then they have to suffer the on-delete ability. But leaving him on the field is just a huge threat, because then we could utilize the fact that he's on the field to then go into either of our level 7s, and that kind of seems like that's the direction that the card wants to go into. Even though, yes, there are more powerful and efficient cards to go up into Chaosmon even faster, that's not necessarily the whole point. It's just to try to utilize banchleomon in everything that card is doing. So I definitely think, like, with that style where we just want to digivolve into him rested, it's really interesting and a really unique way to play the card, on top of which we don't really feel bad doing that same type of strategy with Nidhoggmon, just because he has some slightly higher DP, and if the opponent's board is cleared, then they're not really going to have a whole lot of cards to respond with, just because he does have a slightly higher Evo cost. And then same thing with Nidhoggmon. Once Nidhoggmon's ability is all done, then he's just a really good body to sit on it to go up into our level 7s with. So that's kind of like the whole intended purpose of just the deck, and we're just utilizing a whole bunch of cards in some very unique and interesting ways. But this is kind of how I would go about looking at a underutilized card and figuring out what is the best way that we could apply that card based on all of the support that the card is doing. So just as a recap, you do have to look at what the card is doing on base, and then you do have to look at what the card wants to be doing, and the easiest way to figure that out is through the evolution line. So that way you could best figure out how to actually play the card if there's no Japanese data to go off of. And then from there, you kind of just utilize that type of strategy that the card wants to be playing with, and then just to kind of build a deck around that type of strategy. So that's just how I would go about utilizing underutilized cards, but that's all I really have for this video. So feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and also feel free to tell me how you best like using underutilized cards. And as always, feel free to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.